But there's another event that we're indebted to Bill Salus, I think, for highlighting for us some years ago, and I think he's done us a service because it was an overlooked psalm, I think. An eminent candidate here. There's a couple of mysteries about the Ezekiel 38 thing. Where are the Lebanese? Where are the Syrians in Ezekiel 38? Where is Iraq, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, Saudi Arabians? Saudi Arabia's on the sidelines. They're not participants, strangely. And then the Palestinians, where are they? You see, it's interesting. They are the immediate neighbors. If you study the previous tribes, they're a substantial distance from Israel. These are the immediate neighbors. They're not mentioned. What's going on here? There are 4 prerequisites for Ezekiel 38, by the way. The nation has to be reestablished as a sovereign state. It has been. The nation is militarily secure. Well, yes and no. A nation at apparent peace in the Middle East? I don't think so. A nation of restored material fortunes? Well, they're not doing badly, but not like we're going to see here. There's something else back in Ezekiel 37. Before 38, you get the whole dry bones thing and all that. And in that in verse 10 of Ezekiel 37 it says, "So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood up on their feet, an exceedingly great army." And the exceedingly is an adverb, not an adjective, which is a very strange construction. That means they become a very great army. There are 4 steps in the dry bones vision. They were scattered, they came together, flesh and skin, and then they came to life. But then they became an exceedingly great army. And the fact that it's an adverb is very strange. Is there an overlooked event that precedes the ill-fated invasion attempt that's featured in Ezekiel 38 and 39? That's a question. And I think a guy has surfaced that may be the key to all of this. A guy with a backbone to really pull it off. We'll watch and see. The book of Psalms, Psalm 83, let's take a quick look at it. Is this a forthcoming scenario? It's the last of the Asaph Psalms. It's the last one of these, and it's a rather timely one. "Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up their head." The psalmist here is trying to get God's attention. Okay? Thine enemies make a tumult. They that hate thee have lifted up the head. It's like saying, hey, God, aren't you paying attention? Whoever these enemies are, they hate God and are lifting their head. That's who we're talking about here. He continues, "They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones." Thy people. God, are you paying attention here? See, they declare that they will attempt to wipe Israel off the map. And by the way, when I first read that, I thought that's pretty interesting. I didn't even know they allowed them on any maps. That their enemies had them on the map. When their enemies say they want to wipe Israel off the map, that's a concession I didn't know they made. I didn't know it was on their maps. They have said, "Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." Understand their motivation. They're not taking spoil. They're confederating in order to cut them off from being a nation. They have said, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel shall be no more in remembrance." They have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee, O God. The psalmist is trying to get God's attention here. And that's the very commitment of Islam, isn't it? To wipe Israel off the face of the map. Okay. And it's the basis of the confederation. That's what unites them. The tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites of Moab and the Hagarenes and Gebal and Ammon and Amalek and the Philistines, the inhabitants of Tyre, Ashur is joined with them. They have hope in the children of Lot. It goes through these tribal names, but perhaps the most interesting one is the first one mentioned, the tabernacles of Edom. there's probably not one Christian in 10 that can tell me who the Edomites really are. It's a very important study to undertake, by the way. But the tents of Edom here is a reference to the traditional enemies of Israel and the everlasting hatred. The Alam Eba. The everlasting hatred. That started in the womb before they were born. Jacob and Esau, remember? They were fighting before they were born. And the hostility of Esau is something you need to track all the way through your Bible. You won't really understand. Of all the different tribes, the one that's singled out for judgment are the Edomites, more so than all the others. The everlasting hatred. And now it continues to drive events throughout our world today, is driven by that. The judgment against this protagonist is mentioned in more Old Testament books than it is against any other foreign nation. So you need to do your homework on who the Edomites are. And yet very few observers can identify its proponents in their contemporary forms. That's a trick. See, ascent into the land of Israel officially began in 586 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. When the Babylonians took Jerusalem captive, that's when the Edomites had their big chance. They cheered the Babylonians on. Bang the heads of the infants against the rocks, they yelled. You see them now quote that in a psalm, but they're echoing what was said to them by the Edomites back when the Babylonians were taking them captive. A place called Hebron, which is about 19 miles south of Jerusalem, began their new frontier. As the real estate was vacated because the Babylonians were taking slaves, the Edomites moved in, took over, cheered their enemies on. 3,400 feet above sea level, established 1,500 years earlier, unlike Jerusalem, was left intact as prime real estate. So you need to remember that the Nabateans migrated out of Arabia into Edom and drove the Edomites westward. And directly west of Edom were the established routes of passage. I'll show you this on a map here in a minute. See, land was historically more prosperous and resourceful than the land of Edom. So unfertile deserts and jagged mountains. And so the land bore a family association, Esau with Jacob. The land vacated since the Jews were being exported in activity. So Edom on your maps shows southeast of the Dead Sea. That's where your maps, that's where it used to be. Your maps are wrong because the Nabateans drove the Edomites westward. The land was better westward. And so the Nabateans drove them and they set up a map. If you get some of the early Roman maps in the 1st century, they will show an area called Idumea. That's the Greek term of Edomite. And their capital was Hebron. And so they prosper as Judah is taken into slavery to the Babylonians. Now, something you may not know, Hebron remained under Edomite control until Judah's Maccabees retook the city under Jewish control. In 164 BC, we have they threw off the Greek Empire. They reestablished their own leadership under what we call the Hasmoneans. What most people don't realize is that the Edomites had to be reconquered by the Jewish army under the prince and high priest John Hyrcanus. And Idumeans were forced to either die or flee or be proselytized into Judaism. So these were Edomites that either were killed or had to convert into Judaism. That's something that's a part of Jewish history you don't hear much about. It's all in Josephus. You can check it out, both in 1st Maccabees and also in Josephus and Antiquities. Now, so to the Roman mind, an Edomite is a near Jew. He regards the Esau-Jacob thing as a family feud. So an Edomite to a Roman is a near Jew, an almost Jew. So when they appoint Edomites to be in charge, they think they're picking the right guys. See? 47, Julius Caesar promoted Idumean Antipater as procurator over Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. And 10 years later, the Romans named Herod, son of Antipater, as a king over Israel. And by the way, his mother was Nabatean, one of those that drove the Edomites to Hebron. The Idumeans had 5 centuries of prior history in Israel by the time of the arrival of Jesus. So it had 500 years of history. The struggle between Esau and Jacob runs all through the Bible. The Herods of the New Testament were Edomites. They weren't Jewish, they were Edomites. One of them killed the Jewish babes in his attempt to destroy Christ in Matthew 2. Another Herod murdered John the Baptist. Another one killed James, the brother of John. The struggle between the Israelis and the Muslims today is but a continuation of this same battle, because Esau deliberately marries in to the Ishmaelites. In their choice of the Jews' worst enemy, the Romans had 2 choices. They wanted to rename the land in terms of their worst enemy. They had 2 choices. They could call it Idumea or they could call it Philistia. And they chose Philistia as being a more clearer, crisper enemy, so that the Latin name was Palestinia. Idumeans were viewed as practitioners of Judaism and not as great an enemy as were the Philistines. And there are many who still appear today as Jews but are really not. And they might be the ones that Jesus refers to twice in his letters. Those that say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. The tents of Edom. Here's some tents of Edom. These are refugee camps that are quite famous. The one you're looking at there has 97,000 occupants. A Palestinian refugee camp. Are they all Edomites? Of course not. Are there Edomites there? Absolutely. But anyway, the psalmist here in 83, picking him up again, he's asking God to do to them as he did their previous enemies. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera and Jabin at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Do unto them as unto. See, the psalmist petitions God to undertake destruction of their enemies as he did during the events of the past. That's what he's asking for. The Midianites, the Arabian tribe that descended from Midian, the 4th son of Abraham by Keturah. They inhabit primarily the desert north of the peninsula of Arabia. As to Sisera and Jabin, Sisera was the captain of the host of Jabin, the Canaanite king who reigned in Hazor, routed by Barak at the plain of Esdraelon, killed by Jael. It's all in Judges. He's making references from Judges 4 and 5 here. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, and yea, like the princesses. These are the nobles, the king, the prince generals, and so forth. The prince generals were Oreb and Zeb. Zeba and Zalmunna were their kings. But those 4 represented the people that God went to war against on their behalf. He said, let us make to ourselves the houses of God in possession. They were defeated by Gideon. Then Ephraim intercepted the Midianites and slew with a great slaughter and so forth. And the psalmist goes on, O God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth the wood, and as a flame setteth the mountains on fire. So persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. See, the Lord's name is the issue here, strangely. The psalmist continues, let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the most high over all the earth. The psalmist is asking God to establish his name over these losers. That whose name alone is Jehovah. That's in contrast to Al-Ilah, or Allah, the moon god. Apparently, the only way the world is going to know that God is God is for him to move in judgment. That's what the psalmist is presuming here. Well, we also discover when Jesus comes back, I won't get into the details here, but you should have perspective. In Ezekiel 25 through 32, it lists 7 nations. Edom's right in the middle of these, and it's the worst of the bunch, by the way. But they are all Islamic. Why are there 7? For completeness, I guess. Interesting. At the present time, Israel is surrounded by immediate neighbors committed to wiping them off the map. That describes us today, doesn't it? Pick up any paper any day. And by the way, it's misleading to represent them as Arabs. That's just a vestige of a totally ignorant, uninformed press corps. They're not Arabs, they're Muslims. There are a number of the Muslims that are offended by being called Arabs. The Persians, for example, and others. It would appear that there's a prerequisite victory for Israel that will set the stage for a subsequent ill-fated attempt of the outer ring nations to seek spoil. I think the success of Israel in Psalm 83 may set the stage for them being an attractive target for Ezekiel 38. That's my perception here. What are the order of events? I think Israel's regathered in land. We've just seen that happen. Ancient cities have been rebuilt and inhabited. They meet Muslim and Arab resistance, of course. Israel establishes an army for defense. Adjacent Muslim nations confederate. That's what we're seeing happen here. The confederacy committed to the destruction of Israel is what we're talking about. A war starts between the confederacy and Israel. The title is regained, my people. God again speaks them as my people Israel. That's a non-trivial label that God would be using of them. Israel decisively defeats the confederacy. That's the big thing, and there's plenty of verses for you to check that out. Israel then becomes an exceedingly great army. It's an adverb. It becomes vastly more powerful than it is today. Israel takes prisoners of war, we find. Jeremiah 48 and elsewhere. The whole region is reshaped. They reshape it. None of this, West Bank nonsense. Israel expands its borders. High time. Israel then dwells securely in the land. That fits the case that Ezekiel 38 seems to be describing.